There is definitely a wonderful sense of jazz improvisation to our sessions today, and we're about to enjoy a certain aspect of that jazz improvisation. Um, and I will explain now that I've cleared off the top of the piano. On Friday night, one of our students, Mr. Victavius Wilson, presented his senior recital, and he presented it in the recital hall, which is just about one floor below, and did a wonderful job. On his program was the spiritual arrangement of Margaret Bond's Sing a Ho. So as soon as I heard that, once I dabbed the developing tears from around the edges of my eyes at the end of the recital, I went to him and asked him, would you be willing to perform this on Sunday? Well, it took some extra cajoling, not so much from Miss Pocock, his accompanist, but from Miss Elvira Green, who knew Margaret Bonds personally, and who I also hope that we will get to see later this afternoon. But Victavius and Miss Aline Pocock graciously consented to perform, and I am happy to present them singing or performing Sing a Ho of Margaret Bonds. So please come. Pocock, thank you so much for that lovely performance. I couldn't help but think of my own memories of church performances, which for many of us in the African American community, those were our concert hall experiences long before we got to the concert hall. Well, back to this this presentation. Some of my notes I had just enough time to draft and print out, and some of them I can read, but I'm thankful that I'll be able to move off script very soon. The title of this presentation, quite admittedly, was made in haste, and would read much more honestly using this title: In Search of Margaret Bond's Artistic Landscape, a Reconstruction. This discussion is a study, a mixture of documented research done against a backdrop of recollected names, places, facts, and relationships, some of which would most likely have influenced the generations of our two celebrated African American female composers. First, and I guess I would have to, if I had a nice PowerPoint presentation to prepare for you, point A would be up on screen right now. The Chicago of Margaret Bond's day must have been a fascinating place to explore on so many levels of investigation. It is already the stuff of mutually understood biography that her parental ancestry and home life were distinguished by great educational and artistic achievements, supported by a dedicated African American community and anchored by a strong personal and communal Christian faith. Point B. Margaret's mother, Estella C. Bonds, was a pianist, organist, and choral director at Berean Baptist Church, which until 1962, or whose building until 1962, was at 5147 South State Street. Located in the heart of what is still known as Bronzeville, Chicago's South Side, it was one of the several large historic black Baptist church bodies within the city. Its history goes back as far as 1900, but that history was the result of a church split, whose origins can be traced back to Olivet Baptist Church, which was founded in 1861. While I step aside to get a bottle of water, imagine a black Baptist church congregation in the North the year that the Civil War starts. An amazing thought. This information is documented, or was documented, in a study of Negro church history in Chicago, written by Dr. Miles Mark Fisher, who was the longtime pastor of White Rock Baptist Church here in Durham. While the musical practices of those churches as a large group aren't given any discussion in that study, matters of theology and doctrine are, and such matters invariably and inevitably lead to disagreements, dissension, and divisions of congregations. I'm reminded of a humorous but very accurate statement made by Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, himself a Baptist minister and one of the, I guess we would say, godfathers of the civil rights movement, who marched with Dr. King. In a documentary about the history of gospel music, Dr. Walker makes the statement that we defy principles of mathematics in the black church. We multiply by dividing. And so Berean Baptist Church's origins speak directly to that statement. They were started as a result of a church split. One of my first sources of late 19th and early 20th century African American music history in Chicago was the study titled Black Concert Music in Chicago, 1890 to the 1930s by Elistine Perkins Holley. That last name is spelled H-O-L-L-Y, and I have not found out yet if there's any kind of family tree connection between my direct ancestors and hers. In this study, a treasure trove of names and activities connected to concert music, much is made to concert music, much of which was performed in church sanctuaries. My initial discovery of the history of these aforementioned black church congregations was made here, and in its pages of discussion one can find the spiritual, academic, artistic, and professional sources of the most profound expression among these Americans of multivalent African descent in Chicago. The activities of the Choral Study Club at Reverend Ransom's Institutional Church, which the Choral Study Club was founded in 1900 by Pedro Tinsley, and the Umbrian Male Glee Club, which was founded in 1895 at Bethel AME Church, were two examples of the emphasis placed on Western art musical literacy among African American musicians. Orchestras developed and flourished among the African American community through church congregations as well, but their activities were limited, of course, by the availability of instruments and specialized instruction. It's amazing to think of churches with orchestras that played in their worship services. I've discovered discussions of church music and worship traditions in places both likely and unlikely. In the book, Baseline, jazz bassist and avid photographer Milt Hinton talks about his family history. He mentions, he talks about his family history, which includes their move to Chicago from Vicksburg, Mississippi, as a part of the Great Migration. He mentions that his family attended Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was one of at least 12 churches who are institutionally descended from Olivet Baptist Church. Remember, I told you that they multiplied by dividing. He recalled the regular performance of European classical music in the worship service. While such a decision of including music that had to have been called highbrow at the time in the service, that had to have made a statement that reflected more upon issues of class through church affiliation than matters of Christian doctrine or theology. And if you'll bear with me for a second, I have additional printouts from various sources related to these. There it is. In the study titled Conflict and Resolution in the Life of Thomas Andrew Dorsey, Michael W. Harris writes the following, and I can even take you to, not so much to the book itself, but to the excerpt, a paragraph on page 178. Quote, during the late 1920s, Chicago's old line black Protestant churches stood as virtual mirrors of their white counterparts in terms of the worship aesthetic. No part of the Sunday morning liturgy was more illustrative of this than the music. At churches such as Olivet and Pilgrim Baptist, two of the largest congregations in black Chicago, choirs sang the Western European style anthems and sacred compositions of composers such as Mendelssohn, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, and Rossini. Ministers in these churches carefully designed worship to control congregational participation, especially its more spontaneous aspects. This meant that they had to avoid the music associated with traditional black worship. Black sacred song could be heard only in its anglicized version, known as the concert or arranged Negro spiritual. More seriously, these ministers had to control their preaching so as not to stir emotions to the point that the congregation would erupt into the jubilation and demonstrativeness of the classic black church. The effect of these standards of worship was to alter profoundly the ethos of upper crust black churches to the point that they could be considered black only in terms of the racial certainly not the cultural makeup of their congregations. Now that's a profound statement, and it's one that, as we think about it, even for a second, and then think about Margaret Bonds and her music, and the influences that we can hear in that music, that presents a profound matter of question and conversation. And that's one of the places that I think we, can interject our opinions and our perspectives and viewpoints. Because Berean Baptist was most likely one of those mainline congregations. You would hear the heavens are telling from the creation, in those church services. You would not hear, in fact, most likely by the time Margaret came on the scene, because of the influence of the Fisk Jubilee Singers and the Hampton Choir and Harry T. Burley, and we can't forget R. Nathaniel Dett, who by that time was, he'd become something of a very quick legend in his own time as a pianist, composer, and director of the Hampton Glee Club, or the Hampton Choirs. So we have this strange dichotomy between the anglicized performance tradition of the spiritual and this notion of the original Negro spiritual. And of course, by 1920, well, we know from the slave narratives that we can still go to the Library of Congress to see and read that in the 1920s and 30s, there were still surviving emancipated, or what were at that time still properly referred to as freedmen. They were still alive to share their first-person slave narratives. But the idea of them singing an authentic Negro spiritual, or an authentic plantation song, or sorrow songs, as W.E.B. Du Bois referred to them as, that was probably something that would not have been highlighted. And even when the Fish Jubilee Singers began their tours of America and eventually Europe to take the Negro spiritual to the world, they took a dressed up, anglicized version of that spiritual. I should read on at least one more excerpt from Michael Harris's study. The effort to obliterate indigenous worship music grew through the late 19th century with the compositions of Negro spirituals by noted black composers such as Harry T. Burley and John Work. Work was explicit about his concern that the slave spiritual, if not anglicized, would serve as an impediment to racial progress. Quote, in truth, the general adaptability of this music to a high degree of development is its hope of gaining artistic recognition. It deserves to be put into a finished form. It lends itself admirably to such a purpose, and those who would keep it as it was first reduced to writing in their mistaken zeal would doom it to stagnation and to the contempt of highly musical people. That was John Work writing in 1915. This trend was so pronounced by the 1920s, especially among the black elite, and therefore in their churches, such as Olivet and Pilgrim Baptist in Chicago, that one exasperated observer, C.W. Hine, labeled the music, quote, denatured spirituals, end of quote. The attempt, he said, was to dress them up. The whole process reminded him of, quote, the attempt of one race to remove the curl from the hair and of the other to put it in. Again, that's one of those quotes you have to just sort of let settle for a while and then think about it. I'm even reminded of the one moment in Terrence McKnight's documentary about Florence Price where he made the statement of, I guess what I would just have to call validation. The idea that the creation of one group of people is not given validation or legitimacy until its existence is recognized and celebrated by another race. And then that validation is implicit permission given to the creating race to celebrate itself. And thankfully, at least in my memory, since 1969, with the conference that I believe was Undine Smith Moore at Indiana University, and you know, I guess the phrase "long time coming" comes to mind. That we have at least been, with successive generations, ours inclusive, making the steps to validate what is there and what is our own, and giving it legitimacy, whether it is recognized or celebrated by others or not. If we don't celebrate it, who will? And I apologize if that sounds a little Jesse Jackson Senior-ish. Senior, okay? Okay, at this point, I guess I would move on to my C, or my point C on my imaginary PowerPoint presentation. And this is where I hope it gets a bit more fun and entertaining, relatively speaking, as if church services aren't entertaining in and of themselves. Certainly Dick Gregory has talked about the fact that his comic genius did not come from comedy clubs, but he says it comes from family. And he talked about church pastors who can preach 52 Sundays a year, do new material every Sunday, and not repeat the thing, and to say that it is funny. You know, we get much of our sense of humor and our approaches to humor, and certainly we musicians are not immune to that humor. At this point, though, I'd like to shift away, or shift the focus of discussion from church musical activities to the public schools in Chicago, which were both numerous and highly active for both whites and Negroes at the time. The best known high school music programs, and this is not, I mean, I can only mention at least 3 high schools at this point, or maybe 4, at least because maybe even 5 or 6. The best known high school music programs in Chicago were to be found at Wendell Phillips High School, DuSable High School, Margaret Bonds went to Parker High School, Cornelius Johnson went to Julian High School, Lenora Helm Hammonds went to Lynn Bloom Tech, so I have to include those at least. But Wendell Phillips and DuSable, in their time, were virtual conservatories of music. Now legendary musicians, artists, and entertainers were products of the bands, orchestras, and choirs of those schools. I've already mentioned that Milt Hinton, his family migrated from Vicksburg, Mississippi to Chicago. He attended Wendell Phillips High School. Roberta Martin, the legendary gospel pianist, singer, and vocal ensemble director, also attended Wendell Phillips High School. I've come across 3 names that seem to be something of a legendary triumvirate of public school African-American teachers at these high schools. The first is Mildred Bryant Jones. Milt Hinton mentions her in his pictoriography, Baseline, and she was in fact, Hinton writes that she had her doctorate in music when he was going to Wendell Phillips. Another name, Major N. Clark Smith, was the band director at Wendell Phillips. And we're talking the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, that they were in Chicago teaching at the time. The third name is Colonel Walter H. Diet. If we were to do a study of jazz musicians that were active between the 1950s and yesterday, you can find evidence of Walter Diet's pedagogical influence on their musicianship, on their careers, and on their accomplishments. by no means is this, this group of three alone. They just happen to be the ones their names happen to be the ones that came up, first in the sources that I was able to put my hands on fastest. But now, as to what contact they may or may not have had with Margaret Bonds or with Estella Bonds, that is still one of those Margaret Bonds, Florence Price mysteries that are just sort of floating out there in the creative atmosphere, waiting to be identified and rediscovered and celebrated. One name that I should mention, and again, this is one of those kitchen conversations, what did you know so and so? Oh, girl, no, please. It's that kind of conversation. We know that Toy Harper had a relationship, a very close personal relationship, friendly relationship with Langston Hughes. But I came across the name Emerson Harper. Emerson Harper was Toy Harper's husband. Emerson Harper came out of the Jenkins Orphanage band. The Jenkins Orphanage band, founded by Parson Jenkins, whose son Edmund Thornton Jenkins was a contemporary of Samuel Coleridge Taylor. Went to study in London at the Royal College of Music and knew Coleridge Taylor personally. And again, Coleridge Taylor, in his time, around the turn of the century, was recognized as one of those leading figures in classical music among African Americans. Of course, the interesting thing about him was that he wasn't African American. I refer to him as Anglo-African. His father was from Sierra Leone, his mother an English woman, and he lived most of his life in London, but he did make 3 concert tours of the United States in 1904, 1906, and 1910. Unfortunately, like Mozart, Georges Bizet, and Charlie Parker, he did not live to see the age of 40. He passed at the age of 37 in 1912. But back to the Jenkins Orphanage Band. Emerson Harper is an alumnus of the Jenkins Orphanage Band. By 1916, we find him in New York, playing with a society orchestra called the Leroy Smith Society Orchestra from 1918 to 1933. Now, I haven't seen Ken Burns' film on Prohibition yet, but Prohibition lines right up with the same time that Emerson Harper was playing with the Society Orchestra in New York. But we can find him there in New York, and he was there right at the same time that folks like Langston Hughes moved from Chicago to Cleveland and eventually to New York. And Langston always said that he went to New York really to see Shuffle Along. He just told his father he was going to Columbia, to go to school. But once he heard Shuffle Along, the die was cast. But we find Emerson Harper in that same artistic, cultural, social milieu. He would go on to work with Fletcher Henderson's band in the 1940s. And certainly by that time, Margaret Bonds was in New York. And so because of Margaret's close relationship with Langston, which developed in 1936 in Chicago through her mother's, I guess we should just call it the Chicago Dark Tower, because that was the Chicago equivalent of Alelia Walker's salon up on Strivers Row in Harlem. And because of Langston's relationship with Emerson and Toy Harper, that puts all 4 of those folks not only in the same place, but in a very close artistic relationship. And again, that is an amazing and very empowering thing to discover. It's so easy for us, and now that we're in Women's History Month and we've made it through, Negro Employment Month, as Dr. McNeil referred to it as. Um, we realize coming in that there is so much more historical information that we have to celebrate. And just because it is not included in a book, or because there is not a name that turns up in the index to that book, does not mean that the name or the information is unimportant. In fact, Emerson Harper and Langston Hughes collaborated on a song titled "I'm Marching Down Freedom Road." Now, the name of that song implies the work of the Civil Rights Movement, but the song dates from 1942, which again is one of those things that gets our eyebrows going up, particularly in light of, you know, say the movie Red Tails that was playing in the theaters this time last year. In fact, I just picked up a book, one of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's books. It's about the 761st Tank Battalion, which was probably fighting in Germany in 1942, but as a segregated unit, and they were the tank battalion equivalent of the Red Tails. But so in Harlem, it is interesting that Margaret tried to recreate the same kind of artistic coterie of friends that her mother had created in Chicago. Certainly her contact with and the influence of Will Marion Cook and Abby Mitchell certainly continued, even though Will Marion Cook would pass off the scene in 1944. And I think that Abby Mitchell did not live much longer than that. I don't know an exact, I can't recall an exact date right now. But when we hear and deal with the music of Margaret Bonds, it is quite interesting and amazing that all of that cultural and artistic baggage was already there, and that, at least in this limited presentation, we get to unearth just a bit of it. It's kind of like digging in the sand for something that's just below the surface. I will say one funny thing, or it's actually a rather cute thing that I discovered about Mildred Bryant Jones. If you go to the UMass Amherst Library's website, you will find that W.E.B. Du Bois's effects, literary effects, have been digitized, and in that collection you can find digitized handwritten letters from Mildred Bryant Jones to W.E.B. Du Bois, and I think she was sweet on W.E.B. I think she thought highly of him, and you know, and these letters demonstrate that she thought of him as a very influential person, which of course he was, and it was just quite cute to see and to be able to read these letters, and I just happened to come across them right before, you know, right about Thursday or Friday, literally. So, but at this point, let's see, we have just enough time to entertain a few questions or comments before moving into the next session. So, are there any questions, comments relative to the information that you've just heard? All right.
Yes,
Well,
I do have one.
yes.
You mentioned around the turn of the century there was a mirroring between the white church and the black church in terms of the type of music that they would do. Black church would do the same kind of music. Why?
I think the reason why has a lot to do with the period of American history that immediately follows the Civil War. We tend to call it Reconstruction. If you go to certain parts of the South, they might even go so far as to call it redemption. because the South militarily lost the Civil War, but they really won Reconstruction. They won it politically, they won it socially, they won it illegally, at least as far as the Constitution of the United States is concerned. And the effects of that we can certainly still see and feel today. But the one thing we must realize and acknowledge about the United States of America following the Civil War is that it became a much different country. It became a different country in terms of its cultural growth. We could not, and when I say we, I'm saying we, but looking back into a dark mirror into the past, Americans could no longer think of themselves as these young upstarts that just arrived on the boat from wherever they arrived from. You know, a sense of American identity had really, you know, it had taken hold. It had to take hold in a completely different way after the Civil War, or after Reconstruction even. The unfortunate thing is that instead of slavery versus freedom, we had the folks that have the most money, that have the greatest access to social, economic, and political power running things, and then you had the immigrants, the freed slaves. They were on a second and even sometimes a third tier. We tend to just use the words Jim Crow to speak of that second and third tier. But in the face of all of that, the religious practices of the United States, you know, really continue. The irony is that the attitudes of those worship traditions relative to what was happening politically didn't really match what was being taught in Sunday school, preached from the pulpit. You know, and certainly when you talk about race violence, you know, it's kind of hard to justify or, you know, stratify or, you know, line up race violence and Christian piety and charity. And again, that was just a very disturbing, you know, fact. But in terms of the traditions, and of course we certainly have to remember that the American classical music tradition really begins in those years after Reconstruction. When you look at the founding of Juilliard, Eastern School of Music, New England Conservatory, all of that got started in the 1870s, 1880s.
And also American popular music.
Yes, yes.
So what do you think the attitude was of the new Negro?
As far as music?
Yeah,
Or, well,
because you know there's a new Negro movement that was from Holley.
And of course, that new Negro movement sought to step aside from the notions of the old Negro, and the old Negro could very well have been those folks that saw emancipation. When Dr. Brown gave her keynote address, she talked about Mifflin Gibbs, who she referred to as a new Negro. And certainly his efforts in Arkansas in the 1870s and 1880s definitely looked ahead to what folks in Harlem would be thinking and trying to do there. But he wasn't in New York. He wasn't uptown. He was in Arkansas. You know, the fortunate thing is that it was in that little window of time right after Reconstruction, or right after the military ended Reconstruction, that he was able to flourish. And the sad thing is that it didn't last. But I think even in terms of our regard for the fine arts, in that small window of time, we, I think, got to celebrate the European contributions to American life and actually embrace them. Because for that short period of time, we were embraced as Americans. But the problem is that the Civil War and all of the strife and sadness that it brought, And then again, that push to regain, you know, for the defeated South, the defeated white South to regain power. Of course, that trumped the fine arts, I'm afraid. You know, to be honest with you, even trumped the Christian religion. You know, they changed their, you know, angle on interpreting that to justify their lust to get power back. So, and again, you know, I feel badly because I can't answer your question about classical music in the church without referring to all of that, because it is connected. You know, I think also, you know, when you think about how is it that, you know, all these black folks were able to get a hold of all these band instruments? Well, there was something left over after the end of the war. You know, and then of course in places like New Orleans, which has always, you know, been a cosmopolitan musical city, you know, you know, instruments are available. You know, music is available. You know, so I mean, again, that's the thing about Margaret Baum's music. You know, it reflects, you know, a perpetual conversation. Yes.
Sort of one of the challenges I'm having with my current dissertation state that it's in is that I do have a small chapter on the new Negro and how the definition of that has changed over time since Reconstruction. It was representing different strategies for representation. So either through economic success, or Renaissance, either through the arts, because it is so much a part of Margaret Baum's music, but I'm having trouble like writing that transition sentence because I know it needs to be there, but.
I think that the discussion that we had right at the end of Alethia's presentation about, you know, Margaret was doing all this plan and all this writing. I said, wait a minute, how'd she, you know, who paid her? How'd she, you know,